Alright, so this story takes me back a few years ago when I worked part-time at a local electronics store. It was one of those small chain stores, the kind that sells everything from headphones to kitchen appliances. You know, the kind of place that's never too crowded, but there's always a steady flow of people. Most of the job was routine, helping customers, stocking shelves, doing the usual. But there was this one night shift, and to this day, it still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. The store had a back room, which is pretty standard for retail places. This one was a decent size, packed with shelves holding extra stock, cleaning supplies, and old broken items waiting to be returned to the supplier. The back room itself wasn't anything special, dimly lit with those awful flickering fluorescent lights and no windows, which always made it feel a bit claustrophobic. It was the kind of place you didn't like spending too much time in, but we had to go back there pretty often, especially when a new shipment came in. Anyway, this one night, it was just me and my coworker, Dave, who were closing up the store. Dave was one of those laid-back, never worried about anything kind of guys. We'd worked the late shift together plenty of times before, so I wasn't expecting anything unusual. It was close to 9 p.m., the store was quiet, and we were just waiting to lock up and head out. I was in the back room finishing up some inventory work while Dave handled the last few customers out front. I had a few boxes to sort through, mostly small gadgets that had come in earlier that day. The back room was cold, as always, and the lights were flickering a bit more than usual. I shrugged it off because that's just how it was back there. Kind of run down, but functional enough. After a while, I started hearing this weird noise. At first it was faint, like a soft scraping sound. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like something was being dragged across the floor. I stopped what I was doing and listened for a second. The thing about the back room is that it's never completely silent. There's always the hum of the lights or the sound of the air conditioning kicking in, so I figured it was just some random noise from the building. But then the scraping sound came again, and this time it was louder. It was coming from the far end of the back room, near where we stored the older stock that didn't move much. I figured it was probably just some boxes shifting around, maybe the AC blowing something over, but something about the sound put me on edge. It didn't sound like something falling over. It sounded deliberate, like someone was moving things around back there. "Dave?" I called out, thinking maybe he had come back to help out, but there was no answer. I could still hear him up front talking to a customer, so I knew it wasn't him. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to check it out. The far end of the back room wasn't a place we went often, and honestly, it always gave me weird vibes. It was darker back there, with shelves that were packed tight with boxes that hadn't been touched in months. As I walked over, the scraping noise stopped, and the room fell completely silent. I shone my flashlight around the shelves, trying to see if anything had fallen or shifted, but everything looked normal. Nothing out of place, nothing that should have made that sound. I was about to turn back and leave when I noticed something odd. One of the shelves was pushed away from the wall, just slightly. It wasn't obvious at first, but there was a small gap between the shelf and the wall, like someone had moved it. Now I know that sounds ridiculous, because who's going around moving shelves in a back room that no one ever goes into? But it was enough to catch my attention. I walked over and peeked behind the shelf, shining my flashlight into the gap. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just some dust and a couple of old boxes. But then I saw it. There was a door behind the shelf. It wasn't like a normal door either. It was metal, old, with chipped paint and a rusty handle. It looked like it had been there forever, hidden away behind the shelves. I had never noticed it before, and I'd worked in that back room dozens of times. How had I missed it? My first thought was to call Dave and ask if he knew anything about it, but something stopped me. I don't know what it was. Curiosity, maybe. But I wanted to see what was behind that door. I grabbed the edge of the shelf and pulled it away from the wall a bit more so I could squeeze through. The door was cold to the touch, and when I grabbed the handle, it felt stiff, like it hadn't been opened in years. I pulled, and the door creaked open. Behind the door was a small hallway, narrow and dark. It was colder in there than it was in the back room, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been circulated in years. My flashlight barely lit up the space, but I could see enough to know the hallway led somewhere deeper into the building. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should go in or just close the door and forget I'd ever seen it. But you know how it is. Once you find something like that, you can't just walk away. So I stepped inside. The hallway was even narrower than I thought, just wide enough for me to walk through without bumping into the walls. The floor was concrete, rough and uneven, and the walls were lined with exposed pipes and wires. It felt like I was walking into some kind of forgotten part of the building, like a place that wasn't meant to be found. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the colder it got, and the air felt heavier, like I was walking into a place that hadn't been touched in years. After a few minutes, I reached the end of the hallway. There was another door, similar to the first one, but in even worse shape. The paint was peeling, and the handle was almost completely rusted over. I hesitated for a second, but again I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, and what I saw inside was unsettling. It was a small room, maybe the size of a closet. The walls were bare concrete, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the middle of the room was a single metal chair, old and rusted, sitting under a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light wasn't on, but it looked like it could still work if someone flipped the switch. There was nothing else in the room. No boxes, no shelves, just that chair. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Why was there a hidden room like this in the back of a retail store? And more importantly, why did it feel like no one was supposed to find it? As I stood there, I heard the door behind me creak shut. I spun around, shining my flashlight back down the hallway, but the door was closed, just like before. I ran to it, grabbed the handle, and yanked it open. That's when I saw it. Standing at the end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long arms that seemed to stretch out toward the walls. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. My heart stopped, and for a moment I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at it, frozen in place. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, and into the back room. I slammed the hidden door shut behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the handle. I didn't look back. I just grabbed my stuff and headed straight for the front of the store. When I got up front, Dave gave me a weird look and asked if I was okay. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, but I didn't say anything. I just told him I wasn't feeling well and left early. I never went back into that back room after that night. I couldn't. Every time I even thought about going back there, I get this sick feeling in my stomach, like something was waiting for me. I ended up quitting a few weeks later, and to this day, I still wonder what I stumbled onto that night. Was it real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I don't know, but I do know one thing. There are some doors that are better left unopened. Alright, let me tell you about one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had. It happened while I was working at a small retail store. You know, the kind of place that sells everything from snacks to cleaning supplies, but it's so small you get familiar with most of the customers. I had been working there for a few months and usually worked the night shifts, which I liked because it was quieter and I could get a lot done without too much distraction. The store had this back room where we kept all the stock. Extra products, cleaning supplies, things like that. It wasn't a big deal to go back there, but for some reason that back room always gave me a weird feeling. The lights were old and would flicker every now and then, and the whole room had this stale smell, like cardboard and dust. Still, it wasn't like I was scared of it or anything. I just didn't like spending more time there than I had to. So one night I was closing up with another coworker, Mike. It was one of those quiet evenings where we barely had any customers, and by the time 8:30 p.m. rolled around, the store was dead. We were set to close at 9, so Mike was up front, counting the till, and I was in the back, taking care of some last-minute organizing. The back room was kind of a mess that day, because we had just gotten a delivery earlier, and there were boxes everywhere. I wasn't looking forward to cleaning it up, but it was part of the job, so I grabbed a box cutter and got to work. I started opening up boxes, stacking things on shelves, and figuring out where everything should go. After a while, I had my earbuds in, just listening to music while I worked. I'd been in there for maybe 20 minutes when I heard this weird noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft thudding sound, like something had fallen over. I paused the music and looked around, expecting to see a box or something that had tipped over, but everything was still in place. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just the building creaking. It was an old place, and sometimes the walls made these random noises. I went back to what I was doing, trying not to think too much about it, but then I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more distinct, like a heavy thud coming from the far corner of the back room, where we didn't really keep anything important. My stomach dropped a little, and I felt that familiar, uneasy feeling creeping up on me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a rat knocking something over, or just the pipes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to check it out, even though every part of me was telling me to just stay where I was. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight as I walked toward the back corner. The closer I got, the more I realized that the air was colder over there. It wasn't freezing or anything, but it was definitely colder than the rest of the room, and it gave me this weird sense of dread. When I reached the corner, I noticed something strange right away. One of the shelves had been pushed away from the wall, just slightly, like it had been moved recently. Now this shelf was heavy. There's no way it would have shifted on its own. I crouched down and looked behind it, and that's when I saw it. There was a door. I hadn't noticed it before, and I'd worked in that store for months. It was hidden behind the shelf, and it wasn't like a normal door you'd expect to find in a back room. It was made of old metal, with rust creeping up around the edges, and it had one of those old school handles that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My first thought was that it was probably just some kind of maintenance door, something the store never used anymore. But of course, curiosity got the better of me. I figured, why not check it out? I pulled the shelf back a little more to give myself space, grabbed the handle, and twisted. The door opened with a loud creak, and this cold, musty air hit me in the face. It smelled like something had been sealed off in there for years, untouched. I shone my flashlight inside, and what I saw immediately gave me goosebumps. It was a narrow hallway. The walls were concrete, rough and unfinished, and the floor was this dirty, cracked cement. It wasn't very long, maybe 15 or 20 feet, but at the end, there was another door. This one was different. It looked older, more beat up, like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling off, and there were these weird scratches all over it. At that point, I should have turned around and walked away. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe I thought it was just some weird old storage area the store didn't use anymore. Maybe I was just too curious to leave it alone. Either way, I started walking down the hallway. The air was freezing in there, way colder than the back room. My footsteps echoed off the walls, and the further I went, the heavier the air felt, like I was walking into something I shouldn't be. When I reached the second door, I paused for a second, my hand hovering over the handle. I had this overwhelming sense that I shouldn't open it, like whatever was on the other side was something I didn't want to see. But like an idiot, I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open, and inside was this small room. It was completely empty, except for one thing, a single metal chair sitting in the middle of the room, right under a bare light bulb. The light was off, and the bulb looked old, like it hadn't been used in years. The room was silent, dead silent, and the air was thick with dust. There were no windows, no vents, no signs that anyone had been in there in a long time. Just that chair, sitting there like it was waiting for someone. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell this room was for. Why was there a hidden hallway leading to this empty room? Why was it in the back of a retail store that, as far as I knew, didn't have any reason to have a place like this? I took a few steps into the room, my flashlight cutting through the dust in the air. I don't know what I was expecting, but the room felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had this urge to just turn around and leave as fast as I could. And that's when I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from behind me. It wasn't loud, just a slow, deliberate scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze. My whole body tensed up, and for a second, I couldn't move. I wanted to turn around, but I was terrified of what I might see. The scraping got louder, and I knew I couldn't just stand there. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and shone the light back down the hallway. There was nothing there, just the empty concrete walls and the door I'd come through. But the sound, it was still there, getting closer. I bolted. I ran back down the hallway, not caring how loud my footsteps were, just wanting to get out of there. When I reached the door to the back room, I yanked it open and slammed it behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. I stood there for a second, catching my breath, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't go back to check the hallway. I didn't even look at the door again. I left the back room, went straight to Mike, and told him I wasn't feeling well. I made up some excuse about a headache and asked if I could leave early. He didn't question it, just told me to go home and rest. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the hidden hallway, the empty room, and that damn scraping sound. I don't know what it was, and to be honest, I don't want to know. I never went back to that store after that night. I quit a week later, and I never told anyone what I found in the back room. To this day, I still wonder if that door is still there, hidden behind the shelf, waiting for someone else to find it. But I'll tell you one thing, I'm never going back to check. Alright, let me tell you about something that happened to me a while back. And honestly, it still gets under my skin when I think about it. I used to work at this retail store in a strip mall. It wasn't a huge place, just one of those mid-sized stores where you could find a bit of everything. Clothes, electronics, home goods, you name it. It was a decent job for a while, but this one experience in the back room pretty much made me want to quit. So, it was a normal weekday evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I was on the closing shift with just one other person, my coworker Tim. He was up front at the registers while I was in the back room, organizing some stock that had come in earlier that day. We usually didn't get a lot of customers that late, so it was quiet. You know, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of a shopping cart being pushed around. That's it. The back room in this store was a bit creepy, even on a good day. It was this large industrial space with high ceilings and metal shelves stacked with boxes of extra inventory. The lights were always flickering, and the temperature back there never seemed right, either too hot or too cold. There were no windows, so you couldn't tell if it was day or night, and the only way in or out was through this heavy metal door that clanged shut every time you used it. Not exactly the most inviting space to be in, but after a while, you get used to it. Anyway, my task that night was to clear out some old boxes from the corner of the back room. We were supposed to make space for a new delivery the next morning, so I had to move stuff around and reorganize a bit. Nothing too crazy, just some heavy lifting and rearranging. I'd been at it for about 20 minutes when I heard this noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft thud, like something had fallen over. At first I figured it was one of the boxes shifting on the shelves. That happens sometimes. Things would get stacked unevenly, and eventually they'd tip over. I didn't think much of it and kept working. But then I heard it again, only this time it was closer, and it sounded heavier, like something was dragging across the concrete floor. I stopped what I was doing and just listened for a second. The back room was completely silent, aside from the faint buzzing of the lights overhead. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I had that weird feeling you get when you know something's not quite right. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just the building settling or something. But a few minutes later, the noise came again. This time, it was much louder, and it sounded like it was coming from the far corner of the back room, the area where we rarely went unless we had to. It's the section where all the older stock was kept, stuff that didn't sell or hadn't been touched in months. No reason for anything to be moving around over there. By now, I was definitely on edge. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The back room had lights, but they were dim, and the far corners always seemed darker for some reason, like the light just couldn't reach. I walked over to where I thought the noise was coming from, shining the light between the shelves as I went. When I got closer to the corner, I noticed something strange. One of the shelving units had been pulled slightly away from the wall, creating a small gap between the shelf and the concrete. That was weird because those shelves were heavy, and there's no way they move on their own. I figured maybe Tim had been back there earlier and bumped into it or something. Curiosity got the best of me, so I stepped closer and looked behind the shelf, and that's when I saw it. There was a door. It was this old, rusted metal door, like something you'd see in a basement or an old factory. It wasn't like the metal door that led to the main store. This one was different, like it had been hidden back there for years. The paint was peeling and the handle was worn, almost like it had been used a lot at one point, but had been forgotten about for a long time. Now I'd been working in that store for months, and I had no idea this door even existed. No one had ever mentioned it, and there was no reason for there to be a door back there, especially not one that looked this old and out of place. I stood there for a minute, debating whether or not to open it. Part of me was screaming to just leave it alone, but another part of me, probably the part that's watched too many horror movies, was curious. What was behind that door? Why was it hidden? Against my better judgment, I reached out and grabbed the handle. It was cold to the touch, and I had to tug on it a few times before it finally creaked open. When it did, a gust of stale, cold air hit me in the face, and the smell of dust and dampness filled the room. Beyond the door was a narrow hallway. It was dark, and my phone's flashlight barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead of me. The walls were concrete, and the floor was uneven, like it had been hastily built or never finished properly. The air felt thick and heavy, like it hadn't been circulated in years. I should have just shut the door and walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped into the hallway, my shoes echoing against the concrete as I moved further in. The hallway wasn't long, maybe 20 or 30 feet, but it felt like it went on forever. The deeper I went, the colder it got, and the smell of dampness grew stronger. At the end of the hallway was another door. This one was even older than the first, with a rusted latch and no handle. I stood there for a second, staring at it, my heart racing. Everything about the situation felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there, but I couldn't leave without knowing what was behind that door. I reached out and pulled the latch. The door swung open with a loud creak, and inside was nothing. It was just an empty room, a small, windowless concrete room, about the size of a walk-in closet. There were no shelves, no boxes, nothing. Just a single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, but it wasn't turned on. The walls were bare, and the floor was covered in dust, like no one had been in there for years. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around, trying to make sense of it. Why would there be a hidden hallway and an empty room behind the back room of a retail store? It didn't make any sense. As I was standing there, trying to figure it out, I heard the door slam shut behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight on the door, but it was closed. I rushed over and tried to open it, but the latch wouldn't budge. I was locked in. Panic started to set in as I banged on the door, yelling for Tim, hoping he could hear me from the front of the store. But the walls were thick, and the hallway was long. There was no way my voice was getting through. I stood there in the dark, my heart racing, trying to figure out what to do. My phone's battery was low, and the flashlight was starting to flicker. The air in the room felt even colder now, and it was getting harder to breathe. I tried the door again, but it was no use. I was trapped. And then, I heard it. That same scraping noise, the one I'd heard in the back room. Only now, it was coming from inside the room with me. I turned around slowly, my flashlight flickering in and out, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The room was empty, but the noise kept getting louder, like something was moving across the floor, dragging itself toward me. I backed up against the wall, my hands shaking. As the sound stopped right in front of me, I could feel something in the air, like I wasn't alone anymore, but I couldn't see anything. My phone's flashlight flickered one last time before the battery died, plunging the room into complete darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, I must have passed out because the next thing I remember is waking up in the back room, lying on the floor next to the shelves. The door to the hallway was gone, like it had never been there in the first place. I stumbled out of the back room, pale and shaken, and found Tim still at the register, completely unaware of what had just happened. I didn't tell him anything. I couldn't even explain it to myself. I quit that job a week later. I couldn't stand being in that back room again, not after what happened. And to this day, I still don't know if it was real or if I imagined the whole thing. But I swear I'll never forget the sound of that scraping and the feeling of something, whatever it was, standing right in front of me in that dark, empty room.